The bass from the Grand Hyatt's Grand Ballroom vibrated straight through the sole of Dylan's shoes, a relentless, heavy thudding that mirrored the headache forming behind his eyes. On stage, under a cascade of blinding white spotlights, Evelyn Vance looked every bit the tech savior the Valley wanted her to be. 6 years ago, Viridian Systems was just 3 engineers in a garage with a server that constantly overheated. Evelyn's voice rang out, perfectly modulated, rich with the easy confidence of a CEO who had just secured a $300 million buyout for their core algorithm. Tonight, we stand on the precipice of an IPO that will redefine data architecture. And we didn't get here by playing safe. The crowd erupted. Glass clinked. Tech bros cheered, and the board members in the front row nodded like proud fathers. Dylan stood near the back, a half-empty glass of sparkling water in his hand. He had written every single line of that algorithm. He had spent 48 straight hours in the server room last November when the architecture threatened to collapse, living on cold pizza and black coffee, while Evelyn was in New York doing press circuits. Great speech, isn't it? Dylan didn't need to turn to recognize the voice. Julian Cross, Evelyn's newly appointed executive assistant, stepped up beside him. Julian was 26, wore suits that cost more than Dylan's first car, and carried himself with the unearned arrogance of someone who had successfully managed up. "She's good at talking," Dylan said evenly, keeping his eyes on his wife. "She's a visionary, Dylan." "There's a difference," Julian corrected, taking a slow sip of his champagne. "By the way, Evelyn wants to see you upstairs in the private suite. Now, before the press gets a hold of her. I'm in the middle of a conversation with Marcus from QA. Marcus can wait." "The CEO can't," Julian said, offering a tight, plastic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Don't keep her waiting, man. It's a big night." Dylan set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray. "Right." The elevator ride up to the 30th floor was silent. Julian stood a step ahead, aggressively typing on his phone, the screen reflecting off his perfectly styled hair. Dylan looked at his own reflection in the polished steel doors. His tie was slightly crooked, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like the engineer he was. Julian used a keycard to open the double doors of the executive suite. The room was massive, overlooking the glittering San Francisco skyline, but the atmosphere inside was ice cold. Evelyn was already there, pacing the hardwood floor. She had unpinned her hair, letting it fall over her shoulders, but her posture remained rigid. On the glass coffee table sat a thick folder and a small, rectangular slip of paper. "Shut the door, Julian," Evelyn said without looking up. She waited until the click of the latch echoed in the room before turning to Dylan. "You weren't in the front row." "The noise was giving me a migraine," Dylan said, walking over to the window. "Nice speech." "It was a necessary speech. The market needs stability before the bell rings next week," she said, her tone sharp, businesslike. The warmth she had projected on stage 5 minutes ago had completely vanished. She pointed to the slip of paper on the table. "That's for you. A special allocation from the board. I had to push Raymond hard for it." Dylan walked over and picked up the piece of paper. It was a check. $3 million. He stared at the zeros, then looked up at his wife. $3 million? It's a massive bonus, Dylan. Most engineers don't see that in a lifetime. Julian interjected from the door, his hands clasped in front of him. Dylan ignored him, keeping his eyes locked on Evelyn. "The Viridian core architecture was just bought out for $300 million, Evelyn. That algorithm is the entire reason the IPO is valued at $2 billion. And you're handing me a 1% tip?" Evelyn sighed, crossing her arms. "We've been through this. The company needs liquidity to scale before the public offering. The $300 million is being reinvested into infrastructure. This bonus is a personal thank you from me and the board." "A thank you?" Dylan let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I don't want to thank you, Evelyn. I want what we agreed on when we signed the incorporation papers in our kitchen." Evelyn's expression hardened. She reached for the thick folder on the table and tossed it next to the check. "Then you're really not going to like this. Open it." Dylan flipped the folder open. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, skipping the fluff until he hit the breakdown of the cap table. "Equity realignment and dilution clause. 15%, Dylan read aloud, his voice dropping an octave. "You're diluting my technical shares to 8%? The institutional investors required a larger pool for the incoming executive team," Evelyn said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. We are bringing in heavy hitters from Google and Oracle to handle the post-IPO transition. That equity has to come from somewhere. It should come from the unallocated pool or your shares, Dylan said, slamming the folder shut. I built the foundation. You don't dilute the architect to pay the painters. The painters are the ones selling the house. Dylan. Evelyn snapped, stepping closer. You live in a bubble. You think because you write clean code, the world owes you a debt. Without my marketing, without my fundraising, your precious code would be sitting in an open-source repository on GitHub earning $0. Julian, show him the projection charts. Julian stepped forward, pulling a tablet from his jacket. Based on the current institutional demand, Dylan, an 8% stake at the opening bell will still clear you over $160 million. It's more than fair. Honestly, sticking at 15% just isn't realistic for a non-operational founder anymore. Dylan turned a cold gaze toward the assistant. Did I ask for your input, Julian? Julian is speaking for the company. Dylan, Evelyn interceded, her face flushing with anger. And as the CEO of this company, I am telling you that this is the final structure. We need your signature on the dilution waiver tonight so we can file with the SEC first thing in the morning. And if I don't sign? Dylan asked. Don't be childish, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Look at the bigger picture. We are a week away from the finish line. Do you want to ruin everything we built over a petty ego trip? Everything we built? Dylan picked up the $3 million check, holding it between his fingers. You look at this and you see a reward. I look at this and I see a muzzle. You want to pay me off, so I'll sit in the corner while you and your new friends take the credit. It's $3 million. Evelyn shouted, losing her composure for the first time. Sign the paper. No. Dylan tossed the folder back onto the table. I'm not signing away my shares. And I don't want your charity. Evelyn stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The silence in the room became suffocating. Julian shifted uncomfortably by the door, eyes darting between the two of them. You think you're indispensable, Evelyn said, her voice trembling with sheer rage. She stepped forward, snatched the $3 million check out of his hand, and with two violent motions, ripped it down the middle, then ripped it again. The white scraps of paper fluttered out of her hand, scattering across the dark hardwood floor. There, Evelyn breathed, her eyes wild, staring at him like he was an enemy. Now you have nothing. You sign that waiver by 9 a.m. tomorrow, Dylan, or I will have the board vote you out of the CTO position for insubordination. I made Viridian, and I can erase you from it. Dylan looked down at the torn pieces of paper near his shoes. The anger inside him suddenly went cold, replaced by a strange, sharp clarity. He realized, with absolute certainty, that the woman standing in front of him wasn't the girl he had married in a city hall ceremony 6 years ago. That girl was gone, swallowed whole by the valley. Without saying a word, Dylan knelt down. What are you doing? Evelyn asked, a hint of disgust in her voice. Dylan didn't answer. He carefully picked up the 4 fragments of the torn check, aligning them in his palm. He stood up, folded the scraps neatly, and slid them into his breast pocket. He looked at Evelyn, then passed her to Julian, who was trying very hard to look anywhere but at Dylan. I'll see you in court, Evelyn, Dylan said quietly. He turned and walked toward the door. As his hand hit the brass handle, Evelyn's voice threw one last desperate strike at his back. If you walk out that door, Dylan, you're dead to this company. You won't get a single cent. I will destroy your reputation before you can even find a lawyer. Dylan didn't stop. He opened the door, stepped out into the carpeted hallway, and let the heavy wood door click shut behind him, cutting off her voice entirely. The rain was just beginning to smear the headlights on the Bay Bridge by the time Dylan pulled his sedan into the driveway of his Palo Alto home. He didn't turn off the engine immediately. Instead, he sat in the dark, the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers the only sound breaking the silence. He pulled his phone from his pocket. It was past midnight, but in the valley, the people who mattered didn't sleep. He scrolled past 20 unread text messages from Evelyn and 32 missed calls from Viridian's PR team. He stopped at a contact he hadn't dialed in 3 years, Arthur Sterling. The phone rang twice before a gravelly, sharp voice picked up. I figured I'd be hearing from you tonight, Dylan, Sterling said, skipping any greeting. I watched Evelyn's press conference. She looked like she was ready to orbit the moon on her own supply. She ripped up the bonus check. Arthur, Dylan said, staring straight through the wet windshield. And she's moving to dilute my technical shares to 8% tomorrow morning at 9. There was a brief pause on the line, followed by a low, dry chuckle. Classic Evelyn. Give a person a taste of a $300 million buyout, and they start acting like a Roman emperor. What do you want to do about it? I want out, and I want to sell. My fund has been trying to buy into Viridian's core layer since your Series A, and your wife blocked us at every turn because she knew I'd see right through her marketing metrics, Sterling said, his tone instantly shifting into pure business. If you're serious, meet me at the Pacific Union Club in Nob Hill at 7 a.m. Bring your original founder's ledger and your encryption keys. Don't tell your lawyer, and definitely don't tell your wife. I'll see you at 7, Dylan said and hung up. The Pacific Union Club was quiet at 7 in the morning. Arthur Sterling sat in a leather armchair in the corner of the library, a cup of black coffee on the small table beside him. He didn't look like a vulture capitalist. He looked like a retired professor in a tailored tweed jacket, but Dylan knew the man controlled over $4 billion in tech assets. You look like hell, Sterling said as Dylan sat down opposite him, dropping a thick leather portfolio onto the table. I didn't sleep, Dylan said, pulling out his laptop and a hardware security key. The Series A bylaws state that as the primary technical founder, I have a right of first transfer for my 15% stake, provided the buyer matches the valuation of the last verified funding round. Viridian hasn't hit the public market yet, so the internal valuation is still pegged at $1.2 billion. Sterling put on a pair of reading glasses, picked up the document, and flipped straight to the signature pages. Evelyn's going to claim this triggers a material adverse change clause. She'll try to block the transfer in Chancery Court. She can try, Dylan replied coldly. But the technical Wufeng are locked to my biometric signature and my master repository keys. If she blocks the sale, I pull the active maintenance license for the core pipeline before the opening bell next week. The SEC will halt the IPO before she can even file an injunction. Sterling looked up from the paper, a genuine, predatory smile spreading across his face. You're burning the house down with her inside it. She tore up the foundation last night, Dylan said, sliding the hardware key across the table. I'm just clearing the lot. Sterling signed the transfer agreement with a heavy flourish of his fountain pen, then pushed it back to Dylan. 60% of your 15% stake now belongs to Sterling Capital. That gives me 9% of Viridian. Combined with Raymond Henderson's 6%, which I happen to know he's deeply insecure about right now, Evelyn no longer has a controlling interest. Dylan signed his name next to Sterling's. It's done. Go get some breakfast, Dylan, Sterling said, taking the key. The board meeting is at 2. I expect it's going to be loud. When Dylan walked into the Viridian Systems headquarters at noon, the glass lobby was in absolute chaos. Teams of developers were huddled in small clusters near the micro kitchens, whispering frantically over their phones. Dylan, thank God, Marcus, the lead QA engineer, intercepted him near the elevators. The SEC just issued an administrative hold on our S1 filing. The compliance team is losing their minds. They're saying an institutional block bought out a massive block of founders' shares this morning. Go back to your team, Marcus. Keep the servers running, Dylan said, his voice completely level. Is the IPO canceled? Marcus pressed, looking terrified. It's delayed. Go to your job. Dylan took the elevator straight to the executive floor. The double doors to the boardroom were wide open, and he could hear Evelyn's voice echoing down the hall before he even reached the threshold. I don't care what his fund claims. Evelyn was screaming at Raymond Henderson, who was sitting at the long mahogany table looking exhausted. Dylan doesn't have the legal authority to clear a private secondary sale without executive approval. Actually, according to Section 4.2 of the Series A covenant, he does, Raymond said, rubbing his temples. Arthur Sterling just wired $84 million into the corporate escrow account to verify the liquidity. The SEC saw the ownership shift and pulled the morning filing. We are delayed by at least 6 months, Evelyn. Julian Cross was standing behind Evelyn, frantically refreshing a tablet. Evelyn, the underwriting banks are calling. Goldman wants to know if the executive team is fracturing. Dylan stepped into the room, letting the heavy glass doors swing shut behind him. The room went instantly silent. Evelyn whirled around, her eyes bloodshot, her hair tied back so tightly it looked painful. You, she hissed, walking straight toward him until she was inches from his face. You miserable, vindictive piece of garbage. You sold out to Sterling? The one man who has been trying to gut this company since day one? You said it yourself last night, Evelyn, Dylan said, looking down at her calmly. You said you could erase me. I just made sure my erasure came with a receipt. You ruined 6 years of work in 6 hours. She screamed, her voice cracking. Do you have any idea what this does to our valuation? The institutional buyers are already backing off. You just cost us hundreds of millions of dollars because your little feelings were hurt by a torn check. The check wasn't the problem, Evelyn. The problem was that you forgot who actually built the product you've been selling, Dylan said. Evelyn's face went pale with rage. Before Raymond or Julian could move, she raised her hand and delivered a sharp, cracking slap across Dylan's left cheek. The sound echoed off the glass walls of the boardroom. Dylan didn't flinch. He didn't even raise a hand to his face. He just looked at her, his eyes dead and empty. Evelyn, stop it. Raymond stood up, slamming his hands on the table. This is a corporate boardroom, not a divorce court. Get out, Evelyn breathed, her finger pointing shakingly at the door. Get out of my building, Dylan. You're fired. Effective immediately. Dylan leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a calm, brutal whisper that only she and Julian could hear. You can't fire me from the board, Evelyn. And you might want to save your breath, Dylan said, stepping back and straightening his collar. Arthur Sterling called an emergency shareholder meeting. It's scheduled for next Tuesday. You should probably spend less time talking to Goldman and more time counting your votes. Without waiting for her reply, Dylan turned and walked out of the room, leaving Evelyn standing in the center of the boardroom as Julian scrambled to field another ringing phone. The conference room on the 12th floor of Greg's downtown law firm smelled of stale coffee and expensive paper. Greg sliding a manila folder across the glass table was the only sound for a long moment. Everything's there, Dylan, Greg said, tapping the folder. A clean break. You walk away with your remaining 7% of Viridian, full exclusive ownership of the core pipeline patent registry, and, as requested, sole custody of Machi. You leave her the Palo Alto house, the cars, and the remaining liquid accounts. Dylan didn't open the folder. And Evelyn's response? Her attorney laughed when I sent over the draft this morning, Greg sighed, leaning back. But he stopped laughing when I reminded him that without your signature on the patent transfer addendum, Viridian's current IPO prospectus is essentially a 300-page piece of fiction. They're coming to the table this afternoon. But Dylan, you're leaving millions on that table. I'm leaving a burning building, Greg, Dylan said, checking his watch. Let's go. We shouldn't be late to our own funeral. The emergency board meeting at Viridian Systems felt less like a corporate strategy session and more like a hostage negotiation. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, flanked by her lead counsel and a visibly sweating Julian, who kept frantically refreshing his laptop screen. Arthur Sterling sat at the opposite end, his hands folded neatly over a pristine legal pad. Raymond Henderson and 2 other teammen occupied the middle ground, looking like men waiting for a bomb to detonate. We have exactly 20 minutes before the West Coast trading block closes and the financial press breaks the story on our S1 delay. Evelyn started, her voice rigid, eyes locked entirely on Dylan as he sat down beside Greg. Dylan, your little stunt with Sterling Capital has already cost this company a 12% drop in its dark market valuation. If you think this divorce leverage is going to force my hand on the equity dilution, you're sorely mistaken. This isn't about the dilution anymore, Evelyn, Dylan said smoothly. Greg reached into his briefcase and extracted 2 documents. He slid the first one, the divorce agreement, straight down the center of the table toward Evelyn. What is this? Evelyn snapped, not touching it. A total settlement, Greg stated. Mr. Brooks is relinquishing his claim to the residential real estate, the secondary capital holdings, and any future executive bonuses. He requires your signature on this, alongside the formal acknowledgement of his exclusive technical patent rights. Julian leaned over, glancing at the document before looking up at Evelyn. Evelyn, if he keeps the underlying patent rights, the underwriting banks will require a new licensing agreement. It reopens the entire audit. I know what it means, Julian. Evelyn barked, slamming her palm onto the table. The outburst made Julian visibly flinch, his face turning a blotchy red. She turned her glare back to Dylan. You think you can hold my company hostage over a failed marriage? I built this brand. I am the face of Viridian. You're the mouth of Viridian, Evelyn, Dylan corrected, his voice eerily quiet compared to her shouting. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a small plastic Ziploc bag, and dropped it onto the mahogany table. Inside the bag were four neatly aligned, taped together fragments of paper. The signature line Evelyn Vance and the amount 3,000,000.00 were completely legible. Raymond Henderson leaned forward, squinting through his reading glasses. What the hell is that? That, Dylan said, looking directly at Raymond, is the $3 million bonus the CEO offered the primary creator of our core architecture last Thursday night. When I asked for the original founder's equity split we agreed on, she tore it up in front of her assistant and threatened to erase my name from the SEC filings. Raymond's jaw tightened. He turned a slow, icy look toward Evelyn. Evelyn, is this true? It was an internal compensation dispute. Raymond, it has nothing to do with the corporate trajectory. Evelyn deflected, her voice rising an octave. It has everything to do with corporate governance. Arthur Sterling chimed in, his tone dripping with practiced amusement. A chief executive who destroys corporate checks and threatens her own CTO with arbitrary erasure a week before an IPO is what the SEC calls a material liability. My compliance team is already reviewing the minutes. Julian, call a recess, Evelyn commanded, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of the table. Julian scrambled, his hands shaking on his keyboard. Yes, everyone. If we could just take 10 minutes to sit down, Julian, Arthur Sterling murmured. You don't have a vote on this board. In fact, given the current restructuring, your position is currently under review for redundant overhead. Julian froze, looking at Evelyn for protection. But Evelyn wasn't looking at him. She was staring at Dylan, her breathing shallow. Everyone out, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Now, leave the room. The lawyers looked at each other. Raymond stood up first, clearly eager to escape the suffocating tension, followed quickly by the other board members. Julian hesitated for a fraction of a second until Evelyn slammed her hand down again. I set out Julian. The young assistant practically bolted through the glass doors, shutting them behind him. Only Dylan and Evelyn remained in the massive room, the San Francisco skyline behind them completely ignored. You really hate me that much? Evelyn asked, the corporate armor finally cracking to reveal a raw, ugly anger underneath. After 6 years, Dylan? You're going to side with an old shark like Sterling just to humiliate me? I don't hate you, Evelyn, Dylan said, looking at her with a calm that seemed to infuriate her more than any shout could. Hate requires an emotional investment. I'm just auditing the books. We were a team. We were a team when we were sleeping on an air mattress in San Jose, Dylan said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. We stopped being a team the moment you started treating me like a line item in your budget. Sign the papers, Evelyn. Or don't. But by 9 a.m. tomorrow, the code repository changes, and you'll be trying to take an empty shell public. Evelyn grabbed the fountain pen from the table, her hand trembling so violently she nearly tore the paper as she dragged her signature across the bottom of the divorce agreement. She hurled the pen at his chest. It bounced off his jacket and clicked onto the floor. Take your cat and your useless code. Dylan, she spat, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. But don't you dare think you won this. I'm going to rebuild this valuation, and when we go public, I'll make sure the Valley knows you were just a mid-level engineer who got lucky. Dylan picked up the signed folder, tucked it under his arm, and looked at her one last time. I don't care what the Valley thinks, Evelyn, Dylan said. I never did. The cardboard box sitting on the kitchen island of the Palo Alto penthouse contained exactly 3 things. Dylan's mechanical keyboard, 6 years of patent certificates, and Machi's favorite scratching post. Dylan zipped his duffel bag shut just as the front door clicked open. Evelyn walked in, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble tile. She didn't look like she had slept since the board meeting. Behind her stood her personal attorney, Richard Vance, who also happened to be her cousin. You're actually doing this, Evelyn said, her eyes sweeping over the bare counters. You're walking out on the company when we're in the middle of a restructuring audit. The divorce papers are signed, Evelyn. My employment with Viridian ended 48 hours ago, Dylan said, picking up the box. Machi, the heavy ragdoll cat, poked his head out from under the kitchen island and let out a soft meow. Richard stepped forward, unbuttoning his suit jacket and pulling a fresh document from his leather briefcase. Not so fast, Dylan. We filed an emergency motion in Santa Clara County Court this morning. We are disputing the asset division on the grounds of corporate coercion. Until the judge reviews Arthur Sterling's involvement, all secondary assets, including the technical IP transfer and the residential rights, are frozen. Dylan didn't look at the lawyer. He kept his eyes on Evelyn. You're freezing the IP? You realize that means the dev team can't push the security patches for the AWS servers tonight. That's your problem, Evelyn said, crossing her arms. Or rather, it's Sterling's problem now. You want to play hardball with my company? Then you don't get to walk away clean. Richard, tell him the rest. We are also filing for full custody of the cat, Richard stated, pointing a pen toward Machi. The pet was purchased using a corporate credit card during the Series B funding cycle. Technically, the animal is Viridian property listed under Office Wellness Assets. Dylan let out a short, dry laugh. He set the box back down on the counter, walked over, and scooped Machi into his arms. The cat immediately began to purr, resting its heavy chin on Dylan's shoulder. An Office Wellness Asset, Dylan repeated, his voice dropping to that dangerously quiet level Evelyn knew all too well. You didn't even know what brand of food he ate, Evelyn. You yelled at me for bringing him to the office because his fur got on your Celine blazer. It's about leverage, Dylan, Evelyn said, stepping closer, her voice tight. You think you can just hand my core code to Arthur Sterling and move into some tech bro bachelor pad without any consequences? Sign the amended IP waiver. Give me back the 7% retention, and I'll tell Richard to drop the injunction. You can keep the cat. You can even keep the $3 million. No, Dylan said. Evelyn blinked, caught off guard by the immediacy of it. What do you mean, no? Look around you. Marcus and half the QA team are threatening to walk out because they found out you left. The institutional investors are suffocating me with calls. I need you back in that server room for just 3 months to stabilize the migration, Dylan. Just 3 months, and I'll let you go. I'm not your tech support anymore, Evelyn, Dylan said. He walked past her, carrying Machi in one arm and gripping the cardboard box with his free hand. Richard stepped in front of the door, blocking the exit. Mr. Brooks, if you leave this premises with corporate property, I will call the Palo Alto PD and report a grand theft. Dylan stopped. He looked at Richard, then turned his gaze to Evelyn. Call them. Let's see how Goldman Sachs reacts when the morning news reports that the CEO of a $2 billion tech company had her co-founder arrested over a house cat. I'm sure the compliance committee will love the press. Evelyn's face flushed red. She grabbed Richard's arm, pulling him back. Let him go. Evelyn, if he leaves with the keys, Richard started. I said let him go. She snapped, her voice cracking with frustration. Dylan didn't look back. He walked out of the penthouse, took the private elevator down to the garage, and drove his sedan toward Mountain View. The new apartment was less than 800 square feet, located in an uninspiring complex right next to the Caltrain tracks. The living room had a single twin bed, a folding desk, and Dylan's triple monitor setup. Dylan was sitting at the desk, configuring a local server environment, when his phone rang. It was Marcus. Dylan, thank God you picked up, Marcus said, his voice frantic over the speakerphone. Evelyn just called an all-hands meeting in the main cafeteria. She's bringing in some external consultants from Oracle to oversee the pipeline migration. They're changing the repository access codes. Let them change them, Marcus, Dylan said, typing with one hand while Machi napped on his lap. The master encryption keys are hard-coded into the silicon of the local servers. If they try to force an override without my biometric token, the system will lock them out automatically. She's losing it, man, Marcus whispered, the sound of office chatter buzzing in the background. Julian is running around trying to get everyone to sign non-disparagement agreements with a $5,000 retention bonus. Half the senior devs are refusing to sign. What should we do? Do whatever is best for your families, Marcus. If you need a recommendation letter for Google or Meta, text me your personal email. I'll have them written by tonight. Are you really out, Dylan? Just like that? Dylan looked at the small kitchen, where a single coffee mug sat in the sink, and then out the window as a Caltrain commuter express roared past, shaking the glass frames. I'm out, Marcus, Dylan said quietly. Tell the team to protect themselves. The storm hasn't even hit yet. The glass-walled conference room on the top floor of Viridian headquarters was dead silent. Arthur Sterling sat at the middle of the table, turning a heavy silver pen over in his fingers. Raymond Henderson stood by the window, nervously watching the rain beat against the glass. Evelyn walked in 10 minutes late, her heels making a sharp, erratic rhythm on the concrete floor. Julian followed a step behind, carrying a stack of leather-bound financial binders. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Evelyn said, slamming her laptop onto the desk. "This emergency shareholder meeting is unconstitutional under our Series B bylaws. Arthur, your fund does not have the voting weight to force an executive review." "We didn't force it under the Series B provisions, Evelyn," Arthur said smoothly, not looking up from his pen. "We forced it under Section 9 of the Founders' Covenant. The moment Raymond Henderson proxy voted his 6% to my fund this morning, our combined block hit 51%. You are no longer the majority voice on this board." Evelyn froze, her eyes snapping toward Raymond. "Raymond, you signed your proxies over to Sterling? After 6 years of me hitting every single quarterly projection for you?" Raymond wouldn't look her in the eye. He stared at his hands. "The S1 delay is killing us, Evelyn. The underwriting banks are talking about a 40% haircut on our opening valuation. We're losing $20 million a week in dark market trading. The street thinks you're running a soap opera, not a tech company. It's a temporary compliance hitch because Dylan threw a temper tantrum," Evelyn shouted, leaning over the table. "It's not temporary," Arthur said, sliding a thick manila folder across the mahogany surface. "This is an independent audit from McKinsey. Over the last 24 months, Viridian has spent less than 4% of its revenue on core R&D. You've been running this company entirely on the fumes of Dylan's 2024 architecture while blowing $40 million a year on marketing and brand positioning in San Francisco." Julian stepped forward, his voice cracking slightly. "Mr. Sterling, those marketing campaigns directly drove our enterprise client acquisition by 30%. "Shut up, Julian," Arthur said, his voice flat and freezing. "Nobody asked the help for an opinion. You've been falsifying the active user metrics by counting internal automated testing pings as unique enterprise logins. My legal team logged the server discrepancies yesterday." Julian went completely pale, stepping back and looking at Evelyn for a lifeline. Evelyn didn't defend him. She slammed her hand on the table. "Dylan gave you those logs. He's violating his non-disclosure agreement." "Dylan hasn't spoken to me since he signed his exit papers," Arthur replied calmly. "He didn't need to. He wrote the original logging protocol so cleanly that any junior analyst with a Bloomberg terminal could see you were inflating the data. You built a house of cards, Evelyn. And the wind just picked up." Raymond raised his hand, his voice heavy. "I call the question. Let's take the vote." "Raymond, you can't do this." Evelyn's voice rose, losing its carefully corporate cadence. "I am the face of Viridian. If you oust me, the tech press will destroy the stock before it even lists." "The press already knows," Arthur said, pointing to the wall-mounted television screen. The CNBC ticker at the bottom was flashing a breaking news alert. Viridian Systems board votes on leadership change amid IPO delays. "We have 23 votes to replace the chief executive officer," Raymond read from his tablet, his voice trembling slightly. "Against 9 votes to retain. The motion carries," Arthur announced, closing his legal pad with a definitive click. "Evelyn Vance, you are formally removed from the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective at 5 p.m. today. Your remaining 12% stock allocation will be locked in corporate escrow pending the completion of the forensic data audit." Evelyn stood frozen at the head of the table. Her breathing was shallow, her hands gripping the edge of the desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You think you can run this place without me?" she whispered, her gaze scanning the board members who had all suddenly found something very interesting to look at on their screens. "You're an old vulture, Arthur, and Raymond is a coward. This company will be bankrupt before Thanksgiving." "We'll manage," Arthur said. "Dylan Brooks has agreed to return as Chief Technical Officer under my management pool. The engineering team is already reinstating their repository keys." Hearing Dylan's name seemed to snap something inside her. She grabbed her laptop, turned on her heel, and marched toward the exit. Julian scrambled after her, picking up the binders he had dropped in his panic. "Evelyn, wait. What about my contract extension?" Julian yelled as the heavy glass doors swung shut behind them. The elevator lobby was dead silent as they waited for the car. Julian was sweating through his tailored suit, his hands trembling. Evelyn, if they look at the enterprise metrics from Q1, they're going to see my signature on the verification forms. I could lose my license. I could. Get away from me, Julian, Evelyn said, her voice completely dead. Evelyn, I did that for you. You told me to clear those numbers. And you were stupid enough to do it without a written directive, she said as the elevator doors slid open. She stepped inside alone, turning to face him as the doors began to close. Don't come back to my office. You're done. The doors shut, leaving Julian alone in the corridor. Evelyn pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as the elevator descended. She opened her texts with Dylan, ignoring the 50 unanswered messages she had sent over the last week. Signatures are done, she typed, her screen blurring slightly as a tear finally spilled over her eyelash. Asterisk City Hall. Tomorrow morning at 9. Let's finish this. Asterisk. The fluorescent lights in Viridian's main server room buzzed with a low, irritating hum. Marcus was hunched over a terminal, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard, while Dylan stood behind him, a paper cup of black coffee cooling in his hand. I don't get it, Dylan, Marcus said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. The baseline compiler is throwing an exception every time we try to sync the production branch with the staging environment. It's not a syntax error. The logic is intentionally looped. Dylan set his coffee down and leaned over Marcus's shoulder. Pull up the origin commits from the last 90 days. Filter by master administrative access. Marcus tapped a few keys. A wall of green text filtered down the screen, suddenly stopping on a specific line highlighted in crimson red. Commit ID 0x9F42B. System override. User D_Brooks_admin. Marcus gasped, looking up at Dylan. Your admin account? But you were already locked out of the system 3 weeks ago when the legal battle started. How could you push code? I didn't, Dylan said, his voice tightening. Look at the indentation style. The spaces instead of tabs. The way the variable arguments are structured. He pointed at a specific function on the monitor. That's a classic Stanford CS106 background structure. I don't write code like that. Julian Cross, Marcus whispered. He went to Stanford, but he didn't have the master keys. Only you and Evelyn had the biometric master tokens. Evelyn knew my old password hash, Dylan said, his expression hardening. She kept it in a physical notebook in our Palo Alto house. She didn't just let Julian in, she executed it using my identity. He tapped the monitor. If this deployment script hits the main servers during the final SEC infrastructure audit next month, it will trigger a memory leak that wipes out 70% of the client database. It's a poison pill. It would destroy the entire company, Marcus said, horror-struck. Why would she do that? She owned 12% of this place. Because if she couldn't have it, she wanted to make sure nobody else could, Dylan said, pulling his phone from his pocket. Keep this terminal isolated from the network, Marcus. Don't touch the commit history. I'll handle this. 30 minutes later, Dylan pushed open the unlocked front door of the Palo Alto penthouse. The sprawling living room, which used to be immaculate, was in complete disarray. Cardboard boxes were scattered everywhere, half-packed clothes spilled off the couch, and a bottle of expensive bourbon sat open on the kitchen counter. Evelyn was sitting on the edge of the sofa, staring blankly at the floor. When she looked up and saw Dylan, she didn't scream or yell. She just let out a hollow, bitter laugh. Come to gloat, Dylan? She asked, her voice raspy. Arthur Sterling's lawyers just served me with a freeze order on my personal bank accounts. I can't even pay the moving company to take my things. You used my admin credentials to plant a logic bomb in the core server pipeline, Evelyn, Dylan said, standing a few feet away from her. Evelyn didn't deny it. She reached for the glass of bourbon, took a slow sip, and set it down with a heavy thud. Julian told me it would look like an automation glitch. He said if the system crashed during the post-ouster audit, the board would have to beg me to come back to handle the public relations crisis. Julian is a sycophant who barely knows how to write an HTML script, Dylan said sharply. He didn't realize that the script logs the hardware UUID of the device that authorized it. It leads straight back to the iMac sitting in your private study downstairs. Evelyn's composure finally broke. She slammed her glass down, bourbon splashing onto the marble table. So what? Go ahead. Call the FBI, Dylan. Let them put me in federal prison. I don't care anymore. I lost my company. I lost my reputation, and I lost you. You think I care about a data corruption charge? Why did you do it, Evelyn? Dylan demanded, his voice cracking with a rare flash of raw emotion. 6 years of our lives. We built that architecture together from nothing. How could you try to murder your own creation? Because it was the only thing keeping you tied to me. She screamed, standing up, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The moment that company went public, you were going to take your hundreds of millions and disappear to some beach, and I'd be left with nothing but a title. I thought if the code failed, if the system needed to be rebuilt from scratch, we'd have to go back to that garage. We'd have to be a team again. Dylan stared at her, a profound, heavy sadness washing over him. We were never going back to the garage, Evelyn. You killed that team the moment you put a price tag on my dignity. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thumb drive, and laid it gently on the counter next to the bourbon bottle. The forensic evidence is on that drive, Dylan said quietly. Arthur Sterling doesn't know about the poison code yet. If he finds out, he'll use it to file a criminal referral with the Northern District of California. You and Julian will be facing 10 years for corporate sabotage. Evelyn looked at the drive, her lower lip trembling. Why are you showing me this? Why didn't you just give it to him? Because I remember who you were before the valley changed you, Dylan said, turning toward the door. Sign the final restructuring waivers tomorrow at City Hall. Hand over your remaining shares. Leave Julian to the wolves he created and walk away. This is the last lifeline you're ever going to get from me. He walked out of the penthouse, leaving her alone in the shadows of the empty, echoing room. The morning air outside San Francisco City Hall was crisp and thick with fog. Evelyn stood near the stone pillars, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of a plain trench coat. The designer blazers and the entourage of assistants were gone. When Dylan approached, a heavy pet carrier in one hand and a leather folder in the other, she didn't look up immediately. Julian's lawyer has been calling me since 6 a.m., Evelyn said, her voice hollow as she watched a tram pass by in the distance. He says Arthur Sterling is threatening a $60 million civil suit for data tampering. Julian is completely collapsing, Dylan. He's talking about a plea deal. Sterling has the logs, Evelyn. He has every right to file, Dylan said, setting the folder down on a concrete ledge. But I made a deal with him this morning. The criminal referral is off the table, and the civil suit against you will be dropped. Evelyn snapped her head up, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and suspicion. Why would Sterling agree to that? He doesn't have a merciful bone in his body. He doesn't. But he loves money, Dylan said, opening the folder. I agreed to stay on as a non-executive chief consultant for the next 2 years to guarantee the IPO pipeline remains stable. In exchange, Sterling drops the litigation against you. But there's a condition. What condition? You sign over your remaining 12% of Viridian stock, Dylan said, pointing to the signature line. But not to Sterling and not to me. You're transferring it directly to Julian Cross. Evelyn blinked, stunned. To Julian? He's the one who helped me ruin the system. He's a parasite. He's a kid who did exactly what you told him to do because he wanted to be you, Dylan said evenly. You used him as a shield to plant a logic bomb under my name. That 12% is going to cover his legal fees and give him enough liquidity to avoid a complete financial ruin. It's the cost of your cleanup, Evelyn. Evelyn stared at the document, her jaw tight. She pulled a pen from her pocket, her hand surprisingly steady this time. You're stripping me of everything. Every single share I fought for over the last 6 years. I'm keeping you out of a federal penitentiary, Dylan said. Sign the paper. With a sharp, bitter stroke, Evelyn signed her name, transferring her remaining legacy in Viridian systems away forever. She slammed the folder shut and pushed it back to him. There. It's over. Are you happy? No, Dylan said, picking up the folder and the pet carrier, where Machi shifted inside with a soft mew. Just finished. 3 months later, the ticker symbol VRDN debuted on the New York Stock Exchange, opening at $42 a share and immediately soaring 20% in the first hour of trading. The tech blogs were calling it the biggest software IPO of the year. Dylan didn't watch the opening bell. Instead, he was sitting on a wooden deck in Carmel by the Sea, 2 hours south of the valley. The constant roar of the Caltrain tracks had been replaced by the steady, rhythmic crash of the Pacific horizon. Machi lay stretched out in a patch of morning sunlight near his feet, completely untroubled by the world. His phone buzzed on the rustic table. It was a text from Greg. The escrow cleared. The message read, Asterisk, your remaining 7% from the IPO lockup just hit your private account. You're officially cleared out of the Viridian registry, Dylan. You don't owe them another line of code. What's next? Asterisk. Dylan typed back a short response. Asterisk, nothing. I'm going for a walk. Asterisk. He slipped the phone into his pocket and stood up. Down the road, nestled between two rows of cypress trees, a small, independent bookstore had opened its doors the week before. It didn't have a digital storefront, and it didn't accept corporate accounts. Through the glass window of the shop, Dylan could see Evelyn. She was wearing a simple denim shirt, her hair casually tied back as she stacked a shipment of books onto a low shelf. She looked exhausted, but for the first time in 6 years, the sharp, defensive tension in her shoulders was gone. She didn't know that the commercial lease for that building had been paid in full through an anonymous real estate trust based in Delaware. She didn't know that the $40,000 starting inventory had been funded by an untraceable angel grant. Dylan watched her for a quiet moment from across the street. He didn't cross the road, and he didn't call her name. The debt was settled, the code was clean, and the valley was far behind them. He turned around, whistled low for Machi, and walked down toward the wet sand of the beach, letting the coastal wind wipe away the last remaining traces of Viridian.